So our next speaker will be Steve Daniels. He's a professor and extension community development specialist at Utah State University. He holds his position since 2004, and he has previously been the director of the Western Rural Development Center at Utah State University. As well, he has been on the faculty at Oregon State and at USU. And much of Dr. Daniels' professional interest focuses on community linkages to natural resources and in collaborative processes in natural resource management. So please welcome Steve Daniels.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate the opportunity. Did I turn this on correctly? It's working? I don't think so. Now it's green. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. Let me sort of describe what I do, so give you a little bit of context. When I describe myself to my academic colleagues, I say that I design and apply discourse systems. When I work with agencies, they tend to think of me more as an environmental mediator and facilitator. When I work with people out in community groups, they tend to refer to me as a cat herder. So you can put me somewhere in that gradient of abstraction. What I want to do is I want to discuss the work of the Monroe Mountain Working Group and realize that I facilitate that group, so I have very little decision authority, and so I'm speaking from that perspective. I also am a sociologist, community development, policy kind of person, so if I say anything dreadfully clumsy about aspen ecology, you'll have to cut me a little slack in that regard. I have a very simple presentation that hopefully we can work through quite quickly and will allow some time for conversation. I did notice ecologists have a cultural trait, and that is you are so fond of photos on your slides, old guys like me can't read the text. So I decided to go for an essentially photo-free presentation today as a response to that. But I want to tell you a little bit about the structure and the function of our group. What is making it particularly challenging to work on that mountain, what we've done in the face of those challenges, and where we're at in that process, give you just a couple of ways to think about theory in terms of these issues, and as much time for conversation as it allows. In terms of the structure, it is a voluntary working group. We have two co-chairs, one from Grand Canyon Trust, one from Utah Department of Ag and Food in the Grazing Improvement Program. We have a number of voting members distributed across these organizations. If you do not know that acronym, that's Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife and Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. They tend to sort of trade slots back and forth a bit. Fish Lake, it involves land on the Fish Lake National Forest. The National Forest System employees are not voting members. They come and they participate fully, and they're deeply embedded in it. Couldn't work without them, but because of sensitivity for FACA, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and the fact that we do use consensus decision-making, they're not part of that process, and any decisions they make are made outside the construct of this working group. This is also a spin-off, sort of a second generation of the Utah Forest Restoration Working Group that developed a set of aspen guidelines that I suspect many of you are familiar with. So we're in an attempt to operationalize those guidelines. In terms of our function, we're there to make recommendations. We don't have any decision authority. We don't tell anybody what to do. We make recommendations. We're trying to balance ecological and environmental health. We're trying to come up with real practical strategies that meet the needs of all of the people who are involved in the situation. Do an awful lot of education and data gathering, generating the information upon which decisions, sometimes tough decisions, can be legitimately founded. In terms of the management challenges, our focus is on aspen restoration. Aspen is the primary thing that we're looking at. I'm going to sort of heuristically divide our challenges into 3 categories, sort of from below and from above and from the broader context, and emphasizing the word heuristic rather than rigorous. The challenges from below is there is a real lack of recruitment on the mountain. There are a number of exclosures in place that clearly seem to indicate that this is browsing pressure. And the browsing comes from domestic livestock as well as the elk and the deer that are up there. There have been some large fires, the Oldroyd fire in particular, if you know that area, that had, it was 1,000 hectares and it had a clone failure. I mean, it got browsed so heavily after the fire that the clones were lost. And that is an outcome that we absolutely want to avoid on any future treatments. And so there's a real concern about the browsing pressure and the ability of aspen to reproduce. That is notably true, sort of the central part of the mountain. That is amazing elk habitat and populations. I just love spending time up there. So if we switch now to challenges from above, this is a set of stuff you know all too well. I will gloss right over it. In these several stands, fire exclusion has meant that the aspen is being badly overtopped, and we really need to talk about some landscape level treatments. I do want to say that the Forest Service is really adding an order of magnitude to the number of acres they are thinking about managing. The whole Fish Lake National Forest is treated a couple of 3,000 acres a year. On this project, they're talking about 50,000 acres. So they're really trying to take a landscape level whack at this problem. Now, part of the problem is there are really high fuel loadings, and that means that mechanical treatment is likely to be necessary before any prescribed fire. And there was a prescribed fire in 2012 that serves as a real important object lesson about this, and that they had in mind doing about 800 acres of prescribed fire. They ended up with about 2,500 acres, not entirely where they meant it to be. And so they learned that their ability to control prescribed fire in the amount of fuels that are up there is not nearly as precise and mechanistic as we might like to hope. And so that serves as an important sort of warning flag that that fire was as successful as it was. And there's a whole bunch, besides just aspen questions, there's a whole bunch of other issues going on here that make this a particularly confounded sort of situation. There's a lot of private land, and there might be as many as 200 summer homes that are up there, and those have absolutely got to be protected from prescribed fire. There are fisheries and water quality issues. Well, there's a hatchery up there for Bonneville cutthroat that may be the last barrier between Bonneville cutthroat being a listed species and not, and that's absolutely got to be protected as well. These are not average elk. This is an absolutely premier herd. People put in 15 years to get the preference points needed to shoot one bull up there. This is where the monster bull came from several years ago. This is, as sportsmen and Fish and Wildlife might say, this is a to-die-for herd. And it's really important. These are not just average elk. The environmental NGOs are really concerned about mechanical treatment in their wilderness proposed areas because they're afraid that it will change the nature of those lands and mean that they couldn't be designated for wilderness at some point in the future. So there's that kind of politic thrown in, and then there's all the other sensitive species and other values kinds of things that the Forest Service has to deal with all the time. Goshawks, boreal toads, you name it, the list becomes incredibly difficult. So those are some context issues. And I probably should have put some important things on grazing up there because that's really an important part of this equation as well. We have a number of accomplishments. We've been meeting off and on most every month for a couple of years now, 27, 28 months. Couple of months we haven't met, couple of months we've met over the phone, but we've been doing quite a bit. We've had a couple of great field trips where we've gotten up there. We have some browse transects in place. Oh, I'll bet I'm driving the camera guy nuts. We have some browse transects in place. A lot of shared data gathering, where you might have Farm Bureau and Grand Canyon Trust and USU Extension all going up there, gathering the data together, which gives that data a legitimacy and ownership across the group that is really, really robust. We've done some really important work in terms of grazing. We've got some of the allotments to switch from cattle to sheep, which is a huge challenge if you know anything about grazing permittees, because those animals tend to select for particular species, and that means that you get a change in a composition over time. If you can do some switching, you can do some interesting stuff. There's also been a large project to increase the infrastructure up there that might allow us to do some rest rotation on the top of the mountain that has been badly needed for a long, long time and hasn't been able to be done. So we've been able to combine a coalition of people, from Grazing Improvement Program to Utah Partners for Conservation and Development to the Forest Service to Sportsmen's and for Fish and Wildlife funding, a whole bunch of stuff to get some large projects done, which is what these collaboratives are well known for being able to do. This Box Creek fire that I mentioned earlier, some of the courage needed to do that, I think, came out of our conversation. We also came up with a large amount of money for the fencing related to that. We got a valuable research partnership with Sam St. Clair out of BYU on this. Division of Wildlife Resources increased their cow harvest in this area by an order of magnitude this last year. And there's a very large veg management EIS underway that is trying to map out how you would sequence and design landscape level treatments up there that include prescribed fire and mechanical treatment. Here's a key thing. We have an operating hypothesis, and that's really quite unproven, and that is large enough disturbances in the Cerro aspen, if you repeated them over time, might swamp the herbivory response. There might be so much food out there that they wouldn't be able to eat it all. And that would allow stems in those areas to successfully recruit and reduce pressure elsewhere. You might be able, as we commonly say, increase the groceries on that mountain. But we don't have any idea how large is large enough. And since this is an untested hypothesis, what if we're just flat out wrong? What if we can't do that? How will we know that it's working or not working? And if it's not working, how will we respond? Can we respond in a decisive and timely manner? Because if we can't do that, the ranger is unwilling to start those disturbances. He just says, I can't do it. It is not responsible for me to do that. So let me show you a sort of a timeline and a heuristic, and these things will get more complicated over time. And so let me start with this one. This DJ thing just is used to indicate passage of time, and it's the end of the year. So it's December to January. And if we have a disturbance, there is an assumption that there will be a sprouting response that'll be front-loaded, and that we might have about 3 years before the clone gets exhausted. And we run a significant risk of losing the aspen component on those acres. So with that as sort of a background, let me go to this one. Here's the process by which the Division of Wildlife Resources might adjust the amount of browsing from wildlife up there. And that is, based on some monitoring, the way that it works is the professionals in the Division of Wildlife Resources would make a recommendation to a regional advisory committee. They would approve or modify the recommendation. A wildlife board sets the management in the spring. You would get a browse reduction in the fall if they did harassment or herd reduction or whatever. And that occurs just before clone exhaustion. It takes so long to get that process to happen that you only get a browse reduction and a reduction in your herbivory just at the very last opportunity. Now, let me add another. Here's the way now Division of Wildlife Resources owns the critters, Forest Service owns the habitat. Here's the habitat timeline, that they would do some monitoring in the year after the disturbance. They would have to do their analysis and internal decision processes. Well, I'm even leaving NEPA out of this thing for the time being, and they might be able to make a recommendation at this point in time. That's how long they typically take to make decisions. Well, if you overlay those two diagrams, what we see is that the Division of Wildlife Resources needs to make a decision here. The Forest Service can't make a recommendation until there. What we have here is a failure of uncoordinated policy. That if you take those two processes and you put them end to end, you have exceeded the amount of time that that clone can wait for you. That we have a disconnect in terms of the speed. The biological clock is ticking, and the policy clock is just clucking. Okay? So that's the problem. That's what we're trying to figure out our way around. And so here's an alternative. Here's sort of a preferred timeline, and that is you develop thresholds for browse pressure before the disturbance occurs. The disturbance occurs and you start monitoring the browse response as well as the herbivory on it, and you apply those thresholds. You recommend to Division of Wildlife Resources in that fall that they need to make a response that can feed into the RAC, feed into the Wildlife Board, and result in a browse reduction. That requires that you have those thresholds built beforehand, because there's no time to make them here. The amount of time that it would take you to develop them would mean that you'd miss this window of opportunity. Now let me show you another version. And by the way, where we are at as a working group is this purple line. We have draft thresholds. And I mean to tell you, we have very contentious discussion over these. They make a number of constituents in our working group extremely nervous, because this is a really trust-depleted environment. Nobody trusts anybody else for some variously legitimate and variously concocted and strategic reasons. But that's what we're doing, is we have a draft set of these that we're trying to hammer out. Because there's just no way to do landscape level disturbance with any assurance that you're not risking clone exhaustion if you don't have those in place before the disturbance. And it's simply a result of the time delays in the existing policy process. Here's another model, which I think could be really cool, and that is develop a sort of a disturbance response protocol. So it is not, you're not having to wait to monitor the herbivory response. You do it based on the size, the location, the severity of the disturbance, and say, based on that, we know enough about what the herbivory response will be that we need to kick things into motion right now. So it is a result of the change in the landscape rather than monitoring herbivory. And so what it would allow you to do is speed things up. That if this is a summer disturbance, you could apply the protocol and just say, we got a fire of the following characteristics, and it means we've got to jump. And then the Division of Wildlife Resources could make a recommendation, go through the board. You could actually get a browse reduction a year earlier. You could get a second round of browse reduction. But that requires an awful lot of belief in what change in the character of a disturbance is likely to lead in terms of this causal chain, in terms of herbivory. This is a much trickier level to get to. But it has some real advantages in terms of shifting your browse reduction earlier in the process. Now let me show you this one. This one is pretty cool too. And that is the notion of a preemptive browse reduction. And that is that in anticipation of a disturbance, you go in and you do a browse reduction beforehand. And so the Monroe Mountain Working Group and the Forest Service might recommend a browse reduction. It starts kicking through the process here. You get a browse reduction even before the disturbance. And so then if you think about that curve that we had, which was the browse response, or the sprouting response, we're already ahead of that. So you could actually get a pre-disturbance browse response, and you could get 2 more browse reductions before the clone potentially got exhausted. I got to tell you, as a professional cat herder, we ain't getting this one. Okay? The distrust among all the parties, particularly among what I would call the elk coalition, of the Forest Service's ability to make that disturbance happen means they're just not willing to make the first move. They're not willing to have a browse reduction on that mountain in anticipation of a disturbance which may or may not happen given government priorities, government funding, government shutdowns, appeals by any of a number of outside groups. It's going to require, we might get there, but it's only because we could use some of the other ones in previous years and convince them there's enough trust to go there. This one we're not getting in the current trust environment. But you can see how it front loads a bunch of the browse reduction as well as gives you several chances to try to get it right, to make sure that you're not losing the clones. And by the way, the reason I'm talking about wildlife in all of this is Forest Service has the ability and the requirement to remove livestock if there's a disturbance. So the only mouths that are going to be left are the wildlife. I should have mentioned that earlier, that the ability to move livestock out of particular pastures where disturbances have occurred have meant that the uncontrolled management component of this does become the wildlife, not just me gratuitously picking on the wildlife. All right, so let me tell you some emerging values that have come out of our discussion. Earlier on, I had talked about our function. Those all come out of our mission. These sort of emerge organically out of how we've been working. I don't see anything in our discussions, in our discourse, that implies that anything is expendable. This would be a lot easier if you said, you know, all the grazing permittees are expendable. Kick them off the mountain. Boy, we'd get serious degrees of freedom back. If we said, you know, elk are expendable, we get rid of them. Boy, we'd have a lot of degrees of freedom. If we said we don't really care about aspen, it can leave, it would be a much simpler problem. But there isn't anything where we're picking somebody out and saying, you guys are expendable. We're not kicking anybody off the island, so to speak. By the same token, no use or attribute is sacred. By that is free from contributing to the solution set. There are certain groups that would like to say, my attribute is sacred. And we're just not letting them get away with that. We're saying, no, everybody's got to chip in. Everybody's got to be part of the process of creating the decision space. We're really trying, this is a very tricky problem. It is so tricky that all of us working together may not be able to solve it. But absolutely, if we get into a us versus them notion, we have enough veto cards and enough delay cards, this isn't going to happen. So it's really got to be an us against the problem frame rather than an us against one another problem. And there is also an impatience. We know on that mountain that time's a wasting. And any one of those scenarios I gave you was 3, 4, 5 years long once we get the process started. So time clearly is a waste, and there's an impatience. I'm going to skip over sort of our theory to a considerable extent, but what we really need to be doing is making progress in all 3 of these domains. We've really strengthened some relationships. There are some people who know and respect and like one another that were not the same before. We have procedures for working together and coordinating the management, and it's all to achieve progress on that mountain in terms of resilient, sustainable aspen populations across that landscape. So I have about a half a dozen members of the working group who are out there. Do me a favor and stand up so that people can see if they want to ask you questions over lunch or whatever. Who we got out there? We got Mary there, we got Vance here, we got the back row guys there, we got Jody, and we got Bill, and we got Tom, and we got Stan. So feel free to ask them questions if we don't have enough time for questions now. I know we're running a little bit behind. But just to prove that a sociologist does know how to embed photos, okay? That's the working group in its natural habitats. We spend a lot of time in a windowless room in the basement of the Superior County Courthouse. All right. Appreciate the opportunity to share these ideas with you. Time for questions. How do you want to manage things?
Time for questions.
Steve, I was a little surprised in your structure that you didn't mention the role of science. That's point number A. And then in terms of the accelerated option, Mary Lou gave a presentation yesterday that talked quite a bit about recovery after fire, and there is some available information there that may bolster perhaps that ambitious accelerated option.
And that'd be real useful. I wasn't here for Mary Lou's presentation yesterday, but I know my colleagues were. I'll bet we can follow up on that. Your point about science, it's so thoroughly embedded in all this that it's sort of an implicit point that I felt I didn't need to make. Given that this is a spin-off of that Utah Forest Restoration Working Group, and their guidelines for aspen restoration are so science-based, so much identify a causal agent, do a management response that responds to that sort of logic is built through this. We have these browse transects, we have exclosures, we have all sorts of stuff. We're absolutely trying to base all of our work on credible evidence and sound science rather than folklore and hope. So that's a very good question. Science is embedded throughout this thing. It permeates it. Other questions that might be out there? Your question is standing between you and the next interesting thing to do. Bill and Tom, why don't you stand up back there? Those are the two guys you really need to talk to, Bill Hopkin and Tom Tippett from the grazing. Oh, elk permits or permittees? Elk permits. Oh, I see. Vance is the guy you need to talk to on that. Elk numbers have elk permit numbers. No, there has been an increase in the cow hunt from 20 to 200. It would be a little difficult to say that is a direct response of our work, but I know that our efforts contributed to that conversation. Mm-mm.
The percent harvest, was that the same during that time when you increased the permit?
Can you answer that, Vance?
We have, that's ongoing right now, so we don't know what the percent harvest is.
And do you base your population numbers on the cow-calf ratios, things like that?
Yeah, that all goes into the population models.
So let's give a round of applause for Steve.